Hi, you're listening to the Jan Spragge Show here on Northumberland 89.7. We're live streaming worldwide at our website, northumberland897.ca. Today I have the pleasure of chatting with a fellow that many of you might know locally, author Ted Staunton. He's in our studios today. His 1983 debut, Puddleman, came right out of the gates, and it was one of Canada's most loved picture books for children. Ted's been entertaining readers of all ages since that time with his funny and perceptive stories of childhood, teen, and family life in many, many books. Trained as a teacher, Ted's also a sought-out speaker, performer, and workshop leader in schools, libraries, and venues across Canada. But this high-energy guy doesn't stop there. Ted teaches the Writing for Children courses at George Brown College and also at the Haliburton School of the Arts. And since 2010, he's volunteered with Code Canada, traveling to Ethiopia several times to work with writers and the young people of the country as they develop the stories of their lives. It's my pleasure, as I say, to have Ted in our studios today. Welcome, Ted.
Hi, Jen. Nice to be here.
Well, thanks for taking the time to come in. Ted, there's so much written about the importance of reading and literacy, statistics, studies, opinions, but I'm really curious about what makes you crisscross right across Canada and travel internationally for the love of reading. I mean, why, in your estimation, is reading so important?
Well, why reading is important, I guess, Jen, is sort of the $64,000 question. And, why do we read? And people will give you all kinds of answers about that. I think that really, when we talk about literacy, people can obviously learn to read. Schools do a marvelous job of helping kids of all kinds of abilities and backgrounds and skills learn to read. The question is, though, can they foster a love of reading? And that brings us back to what we started with. Why do people want to read? Some people want to read purely for information, but I think that's giving things short shrift. There's so much more to be gained from reading that expands our lives and teaches us about other people and just informs us about the world that we live in. Not in an informational way, but in an empathetic way, in an emotional way. And that's something that reading skill alone is not about. It's about content. And fostering a love of reading and really a love of story is what it's all about.
Yeah, and that love of story and that fiction piece is really important, I understand.
Well, yeah. There's a whole school that says that boys in particular at around age 10 or so stop reading fiction and they become just totally addicted to nonfiction if they're book guys. And to a certain extent, that's absolutely true. I was obsessed by trivia at that age, and some people will tell you that I still am, but nonetheless, it's stories that are special. It's stories that lead us into what it's like to be somebody else. Often a story that we hear or a story that we read, more so than a story that we watch, because we live in a very visual culture. But a story that we read or listen to might be our first experience of what it might be like to be somebody else. And that is so important for our culture, because that's what culture is all about. We could live without reading. Many, many people did for thousands of years in different cultures. But they lived in oral cultures where stories were still the core of that culture. Words that got your imagination going and led you to places that you might never get to in your life. That's what ties us together, and that's what stories do so well.
But the stories that would be conveyed in movies or TV don't allow that creative process then, because it's all given to you.
In a sense, yeah, because I mentioned that in times gone by, culture was primarily oral. Today, it's a given that we live in what is primarily a visual culture. Most content is conveyed visually. streamed on the net, it's in film, it's on television, however you choose to absorb it. You can access all kinds of stories in that way, but you don't imagine them in the same way. You're not stimulated in the same way as words alone do. There's a fascinating book, and I'm trying to remember the name of the author, but you can get it at the Port Hope Public Library. Quick plug there. It's called Proust and the Squid. And now there's a title. And it's about how our brain actually functions in different ways as we encounter different kinds of media. And our brain actually works in a different way when we're reading or listening instead of watching. And when you give us the visuals, you take away some of the work that we have to do. And that may sound beguiling in a way, but in fact, it's not necessarily a good thing because some of the imagining is taken away. You know, we've all had that experience of going to a movie after we've read the book, and whoever they've got acting in that title character or whatever is not the way we pictured them. And it's such a downer. We think, no, it's not that way. It can't be that person. And that's so cool. If you watch the movie first, though, and then you pick up the book, you are forever imprinted with whatever you saw. And you've lost a chance there to have your own experience that's unmediated by somebody else. And I think that's a loss. You and I have chatted on a previous occasion about how I was telling you an anecdote about a new book I've got coming out that's part of a series. And when all the authors saw the covers for these new books, everybody was a little bit dubious. You know, I think we all wanted something more profound and deeply intellectual and probably boring. But a kid in a school put it to me best. I showed these students the covers of these books, and I said, "Do you like these?" And the reaction was mixed enough, but one child put up her hand, and she said something I thought was fascinating. She said, "I don't like book covers that show you the main character's face." And that just stunned me because she had put her finger right on the issue here. The book cover was telling us too much. It was telling us how to imagine. And that's not a good thing.
Mm-hmm. So then this whole thing about illiteracy and that state of being able to read but being uninterested in doing so. My understanding is that this is a growing phenomenon. So how do you see that as an author and as someone, I mean, not just as an author, but someone who's right out there getting feedback, and you have been getting feedback from for decades from young people?
Yeah, well, I first ran across this term aliteracy back in the 1980s, and I thought it was a profoundly interesting concept because it was at a time when, Frontier College and like organizations were very much in the news in terms of, in fact, getting people, teaching them basic reading skills, people who had slipped through the cracks or for whatever reason couldn't read. But this particular essay spoke to this issue of being able to read but choosing not to. And that brings us back to where we started. Why does one read? And if there's no joy in reading, if there's no pleasure, if there's no stimulus, if it's just for work or just for information, then we're missing out. So how do we get people to understand that there's far more to reading? And of course, well, I guess, in an egotistical way, it begins with people who do my job. We have to write good stories. We have to write stories that not only touch people, but take them to imaginative places, both figurative and literal, that they wouldn't get to. We have to try to write stories that are going to add things to people's lives. And then we have to get out there and make sure people know about them. Because it's a big, busy world out there, and there's lots of competition for people's attention. So, I, for one, am always overjoyed when I'm invited to a festival or a school or a library or something like that, and I get to meet either my readers or potential readers and have a chance to sort of turn them on to stories. Preferably my stories, but, it's not uncommon. Sometimes when I'm at a school, for me, I say, I saw this book. I've got to read you this book. This is so cool. Wait till you hear this. And that's a great experience, too.
Mm-hmm. Do you find that the reactions have changed since the early 80s in the kids and in the youth. Do you find what trends or what do you see?
Well, there are always trends that are sort of coursing through literature, especially for young people, and partly it tends to move with the demographic blips and bulges. Where is most of the creativity centered? People tend to think of books for young people as being primarily picture books, but in fact that's only the tip of the iceberg. And these days, in fact, probably the biggest market, if you will, is writing for teens, or as they call them in the business, young adults. And that's equally interesting. But in terms of things changing in stories, a good story is a good story. And that's why the best picture books last for generations, as do, in some cases, the best novels do as well, but they can be more culturally dated. The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton will always speak emotionally to teens, but, some of the cultural references may, be supplanted by later books. Still, I think that in general, stories for kids in some ways, in certain areas, are publishers are much more aware now of the potential reading level of kids, and there's a lot wider range of things on offer for kids of different reading levels and reading skills. All of which is fine, but I have to stress that one of the coolest things about books for young people is that grown-ups are allowed to like them too. It's a deeply held this deep dark secret here. And in fact, when you write a good kids book, you write for adults as well, because 99% of the time, the way a young person discovers a book they're going to love is by having it passed to them by a well-intended adult. Maybe even hearing the first chapter read aloud by a teacher or a librarian, or just, an aunt or an uncle says, when I was your age, try this. And that means that that you have to be thinking about everybody when you write for kids.
Yeah, I could see that. Today we have the pleasure of chatting with author Ted Staunton. After the break, Ted will share more of his insights and wisdom about the world of reading, and I'd like to touch probably a little bit on technology and how that's changing the face of reading. I'm Jan Spragge. You're listening to Northumberland 89.7. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to the Jan Spragge Show here on Northumberland 89.7. Just before the break, we were chatting with Ted Staunton about the importance of reading, and I'm interested from our discussion a little bit leading into technology, technology, and how's that changing the face of reading, especially for young people?
I don't think technology is having as big an impact on reading for kids as it may be on, the adult market. For one thing, depending on the kind of book that you're writing, a picture book for young kids, for example, is never going to look as good on a screen as it is on paper. The paper edition is going to be bigger and more vibrant and just more fun, even in a tactile sense. When I talk to kids these days in schools, very, very few of them will say, I've read this on my tablet or my, choose your brand name. Most kids want the physical object, the book. Now, for adult readers, particularly people that travel a lot or prefer to not carry as much stuff, much bigger impact. In terms of royalties and so on and so forth, I don't think my colleagues and I notice very much of an impact from e-reading at all. And interesting sidebar, my son has just turned 25, and he and his friends are all, they're as wired as you can get. They know everything about everything that has screens and so on. All of them buy books. None of them has an e-reader. They look at screens all the time. why would we want that? They say, we want to, they hit the used bookstores, they hit the libraries, and they're swapping, print copies back and forth. Good for them.
Yeah, it is. It's great, isn't it? Yeah, I personally love the smell of a new book.
Well, yes, exactly. You put your finger on. Books have a smell. They have a feel. They have a heft to them. And that's kind of cool. I think in some ways that they're a great piece of technology. They don't even need batteries.
No, they don't. That's right. What's the difference? You with Code Canada, you have been in Ethiopia a few times. What's the difference in what kids are reading in different parts of the world?
Oh boy, that's a fascinating question. It's sad to say what kids are reading in different parts of the world depends very much, I guess, on something very simple, on what's available to them. And many, many kids in third world countries have very little available to them. When I was working with Ethiopian writers and editors for Code, that was in fact part of the concern, or part of the mandate of the project we were working on, which was to get Ethiopian writers to create stories for young adults in Ethiopia about their own cultural experience. Very much in the way that Canadian writers were very concerned with Canadian identity in the 60s and 70s, and still are, validly. But there, I was fascinated by the stories that the writers were producing. They weren't, by and large, writing the kinds of things we would see here at all. They weren't writing, fantasies for teens. They weren't writing dystopian stories. They wanted to write gritty, naturalistic fiction that told the story of what their culture was like right now. And because nobody was telling those stories. And this was, these stories were going to be hugely valuable to them. So I hope that those books find a market, that those books eventually become available internationally, because in their own way they're really, really cool.
Yeah, important, very important.
Absolutely.
Pieces of work for the country and as time goes by for the people. How does that change? A lot of kids I see sort of reading these fantasy, Hunger Games. There seems to be a whole. How does that change what the youth is taking out of the reading, or how does that change things, Ted?
Well, I wish that I were that I had any kind of skill at writing fantasy at all. I'd probably have a much more palatial home, but it's. Their fantasy serves its purpose, and it's always going to be very popular with kids. But I think we forget that. My own private theory is that, he said, sharing it with the world, is that fantasy is just reality writ large. I mean, if we talk about, I'm trying to think of. Fantasy usually takes a real-life emotional situation and raises the stakes by introducing a fantastical element to it. So in a series, what was the series? I think Twilight, the series about vampires and so on. Basically, that's a teen romance. But, in the books, the protagonist is not a gorgeous girl. She's sort of, forgive me, the plain girl. And it's a classic trope of teen romance that the bad boy is going to be attracted to the plain girl, or the uncharacteristic romantic lead. But how do you raise the stakes? So how do you move that out of the high school hallways? I know. The bad boy's a vampire. Oh, that even cuts down on the smooching. And suddenly you have all kinds of leeway to add things to the plot, beyond going to the prom. And, really, all fantasy is like that. I mean, The Lord of the Rings, so you got to return a ring. But wait, dragons, bad guys, elves, orcs, now you're talking. It's easier than going back to the jewelry store. Or, it's easier to write than making a trip to the jewelry store. Interesting.
Yeah, so kids are still developing, as long as they're reading. In other words, whatever it is, if they're picking it up. I mean, it's nice when, I grew up, taking paddle to the sea to the grocery store.
Oh, good for
Right? And so, taking in a lot of our own culture and things, and maybe kids aren't doing that as much, maybe?
Well, I think you have to start with reading with whatever turns you on. Some critics will say that kids should only be exposed to the very best of literature. But really, who are we kidding? All of us who are avid readers, if we look on our nightstands, there's going to be a mixture of utter trash and some real highbrow stuff, right? And I'll probably get in some kind of deep trouble for this, but there's nothing wrong with McDonald's for the mind.
I love that.
We all hit a little fast food. We sneak a little fast food sometimes. So what's wrong with that? Kids will do it too. The only danger is that, if we eat nothing but French fries, we'll never know that there are more, delicious meals for the imagination out there. So you want to mix in some schlocky reading with Paddle to the Sea or The Secret Garden or whatever, or Lord of the Rings. Go right ahead. We all do it. Why not?
I get you. So it's that reading. So how would there's been a lot reading and big hefty books reading about fostering a love of reading in your child. But I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Well, most of them are too hard for me to read. But so I sort of boil it down to just one thing, which is share stories with your kids, which to me means read to your children. One of the best memories of childhood has to be sharing a story at bedtime, or it could be at a dull time in the afternoon if you have that freedom in your schedule. It could be a story at breakfast. It could be any time. But you know what? Not I'll read a paragraph and you read back to me. Not asking questions after. Just read and put it out there. Writers don't send lists of questions for comprehension with the books. Some people will get all of it. Some people will get part of it. Some people will disagree totally. But it's out there just for you to absorb and enjoy. And when you hear somebody's voice reading those stories to you, it's magic. And you know what? Like I said before, a good book for young people will be a good book for adults too. You will find you might be getting different things from it than your child is, but they'll be equally profound and equally moving. Remember what it's like to be a child or a teen or a talking turtle or whatever, or a frog and a toad, or remember what it's like to have those moments, because they're really all about human emotion. And when you and a young person are sharing a story, that's a moment of being together that can never be replaced. That's a profound emotion in itself.
Beautiful. That's beautiful, Ted. It is. It is that, and it's then fostering those skills in a child. So, like you were saying earlier, empathy, all these things that then they can grow, and that's the face of our culture.
I hope so. I was talking with a high school teacher who teaches media literacy. Last year we were having an email exchange, and it was a fascinating exchange. And she was clearly a wonderful teacher, and I wasn't articulating my points very well. And finally I wrote, I said, on the day, before summer vacation or before Christmas vacation, when schools, now routinely throw on a DVD for the kids to watch for an hour or so, on the day that they say to the kids, instead of doing that, you guys can go down to the library. I'll be a happy camper. Because, we don't bait kids with all those comprehension questions when they watch a movie. It's just for fun. So is reading. All the rest comes from that pleasure, from that love. And that's where we have to start. Nicely
said. We're talking with Ted Staunton today, author in this area. Actually, he's from the Port Hope area. Ted, in talking about then fostering a love of reading, and you do write for learning disabled youth, and I'm wondering, are there any differences in fostering that in someone who might have some issues with reading?
Well, first of all, you have to keep in mind always that no matter sort of what quote-unquote reading level somebody is at, everybody enjoys a good story. And you shouldn't be pulling emotional punches or trying to take out the subtlety of the story that you're trying to put across. In terms of writing for people who may have comprehension difficulties, yeah, there are some rules that you follow, and often they're simply common sense. Clearer, shorter, more declarative sentences. Attention to vocabulary, basically, and the pacing of a story. These are aspects of crafts that you work on, and that editors often have very good suggestions about to keep people engaged, to keep it on a level that makes it easy for them to comprehend, even if the story is a relatively sophisticated one. Because, after all, we all live lives of emotional sophistication, and it's important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, so it's just that love of reading, fostering that's the same. So it's basically just the writing. And it's the choosing of the books, too, isn't it? To be more aware, then, that you're picking up one of Ted's books that's been written, or someone else's books that's been written, especially for that level of comprehension. Yeah,
for sure.
And I think in your 7 series, can you tell, I think this 7 series is just wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. The 7 series was an idea concocted by a friend and fellow writer named Eric Walters. And basically, there are 7 books, cleverly, there are 7 books in the series, each by a different author, several of them from around here. There's myself, Shane Peacock, Richard Scrimger, who used to be a Coburgian, and each of us wrote about a different grandson. The premise of the series is a grandfather dies and leaves sort of a bucket list of tasks for his 7 grandsons. And Eric's challenge to us was, could we each make up grandsons? Some of them will be siblings, of course. But could we write 7 books about their 7 adventures that you could read in any order? So there's not a book number 1 or a book number 4. And could we nonetheless make the stories connect together in some ways? Can't give away endings, but can you have people popping in and out, or texting, or emailing, or whatever, impinging somehow on the other stories? So we did these books. They came out in 2012. And to everyone's delight, they were very successful. So we have the sequels will be out October 1st. And since I'm right here at Small Town Radio, I'm going to mention that I'm hoping that on the evening of Tuesday, October 21st, the Port Hope Public Library will be hosting all 7 of those writers for a special event for families, schools, grown-ups. You're allowed to attend, grown-ups. And all the writers will be there. We'll be reading from the stories. We'll be answering questions. We'll be talking about loving reading. So, be there or be square.
Yeah, Spencer and Bunny will be there. And I understand in the writing.
Well, Spencer will, for sure. Bunny gets confused sometimes.
Okay. So. And I understand in the writing you write in a particular way that it's for, sort of an interpretation of a certain level of comprehension, one might say, or how would you interpret that?
Well, when I'm writing in the 7 series, it's I suppose ostensibly the books are for kids from about, grade 6 and up, but I do, I don't know, I'm bragging here. But, I get adults who say, that was pretty funny. And I'm always pleased when I don't say to them, oh, you have a lame sense of humor. I say, no, good, you got the sophisticated bits. But they're meant to be sort of fast-paced adventure stories, but they're also supposed to be a little bit of a spoof on the genre. Each of the 7 books, mind you, are by 7 different authors, so some of them are darker, some of them are mysteries. Mine and, for example, Richard's, he writes about my character's brother. They're a bit more on the comic side, but for older readers, if you have a knowledge of some films that were like this, or some books that you will recognize little homages to other books and cultural checkpoints that you will know.
Well, that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, they're a lot of fun to write.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Well, that'll be a not-to-be-missed event. Speaking of the library, too, what are some of the ways that, other than reading to our own kids, what are some of the other ways that you would suggest people get involved in? Because, we're, like I say, we're shaping the readers of tomorrow. So how do we do that as citizens?
Okay, well, a couple things. And one is absolutely, epitomized by, in fact, Coburg Public Library. And I'll speak to that in a sec. But number one, I said, read with your kids. So coolest thing we've got access to, the public library. It is free. There's a huge amount to choose from. There are people there to help guide your selection. Go with your kids. Go every week. Go regularly. Go whenever. But I have a suggestion. When you're there, moms, dads, aunts, uncles, grandmas, grandpas, when you're there, make sure that the young person that you're with has to wait just a few minutes while you choose something for yourself to take home too. Study after study after study shows kids like to do what they see grown-ups do. Reading isn't just for kids. It's got to be for you too. And if they see you with a book, even if you know you'll never get a chance to finish it, they'll know that that's a grown-up activity and they'll make it part of their lives. Other thing, libraries do all kinds of outreach. I have to do a big shout-out to Rhonda Perry and the Coburg Public Library because every year they do a wonderful writing contest for kids. And they involve school children from all over Coburg and Hamilton Township. And last year, Shane Peacock and I are often involved in this. Last year, we had something like 500 entrants. And if you check with other libraries and other places around the country, this has to be one of the biggest contests going. And that's because that library gets out there and engages with kids. And boy, oh boy, you can't replace that. If you enjoy reading, sooner or later you're going to want to take a crack at writing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. That's great. It is great. I grew up at the library. I mean, it's...
Well, yeah, me too. And that contest will be coming up again this fall. I'm sorry, I should have said that.
Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's very good. What other things do you have in the works right now, Ted?
Well, I'm refinishing the floors. But when I'm trying to escape that, the new 7 novels will be out in the fall. I have a picture book that has recently been signed by Random House Canada for their Tundra imprint. That will be out sometime in the next year or two because it has to be illustrated yet. And then I'm in the early stages of working on my next novel, which at this stage is about a kid in somewhere around grade 6. And I don't want to say too much more about that one right now because every time I look at it, it changes. I think I know what's going to happen, but I may not tomorrow. So,
that's nice.
Yeah, so it's been the last few years have been very, very busy, and hopefully it will continue that way for the next few.
Yeah, well, I'm sure it will. And perhaps when some of your cohorts are around for the 7 series this fall, maybe you'd come back and we'll stuff them in the studio here and
that would be cool.
We'll do an interview. That would be a lot of fun. I'd really enjoy that.
Yes, it's quite interesting when you get all 7 of us together. And usually in a fun way and totally unpredictable.
Yeah, I would think, that sort of that cross-pollination of the books themselves, the writing itself, as well as the people, probably quite different for a writer.
Yeah, it's always intriguing when the books come out. We will have, we may have some insights into what's happening in the other books, particularly if they're sort of cross-pollinating. But when you get a chance to pick up the finished products and you see the hugely different directions 7 people have taken the same idea, it's really fun. And the 7 people themselves are as assorted as the books are, and so it's always fun to get together with them.
I bet it is.
I wouldn't recommend putting all 7 of us in a room this small. The elbows come out, but it would be pretty cool.
It would be a lot of fun. Well, we'll see what we can arrange, because either way, we'd love to have you back another time, Ted. You're always a joy to chat with, and lots of great information to be able to share with our listeners, so we appreciate that.
Thanks for having me, Jen.
Thank you. Joining us in the studio today has been author Ted Staunton. You can find out more about Ted's work by visiting his website, tedstauntonbooks.com. And there you'll find more information about Ted, as well as his books and different workshops that he teaches and that kind of thing. So you can even learn how to write children's books with Ted, which is a lot of fun. Check out your local bookstore and library, too, for Ted's books, and please don't forget to stay tuned here to Northumberland 89.7, as Ted will be a guest later this summer during the show Word on the Hills. We'll look forward to staying tuned for that. And stay up to date with the latest about this show on facebook.com/Jan Spragge Show, and we'll be sure to have Ted back another time. I'd like to hear your thoughts about the show, so do message me, and I appreciate the time that you've taken to listen. I'm Jan Spragge. We're looking forward to hanging out with you next time here on Northumberland 89.7. Be well.